Do I have to look into a camera or?
Good afternoon. It has been almost 6 months since the Trump administration withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran, and it has been almost 4 months since the imposition of the so-called toughest round of sanctions the United States had ever undertaken against Iran. Today, we will discuss the impact of these actions, and my guest is Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad. Welcome.
Teşekkürler.
He is the visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, and also you are the Iran expert of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Are you?
I was before I joined Brookings.
Okay, and thank you very much for being with us today. Obviously, you know, my first question or this program would be around how effective has been these sanctions actions so far. But maybe before that, you could tell us maybe briefly what does Mr. Trump really want from Iran, and what are the aims of these sanctions?
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Well, what the Trump administration is doing in terms of its Iran strategy is still a big question. So officially, the Trump administration is pursuing a so-called maximum pressure strategy vis-à-vis Iran that consists of quite harsh sanctions, economic sanctions, that were reimposed after the withdrawal from the JCPOA that you mentioned earlier. And the rationale behind this maximum pressure strategy towards Iran is that with economic challenges being exacerbated, the Iranian regime at home will have more difficulties, and probably there are going to be more protests against the regime. But probably more importantly, the rationale is that with Iran having less funds because of the sanctions, Iran can not export as much oil as it did. And this is a bulk of the budget, after all. It's a great part of the budget. So that with those shrinking resources, the Iranian state cannot engage so forcefully in the region as it used to. So that Iran's regional behavior might be checked. So this is one of the main rationale behind the strategy.
But given that the biggest exporters of Iranian oil, including Turkey, has been given, they are exempt from these sanctions, and also at least for the next a few months more, and also EU is against these sanctions, and they have devised some mechanisms to circumvent these sanctions. Do you think, and it is working now, these sanctions, to this effect you mentioned, especially pressuring the Iranian regime in terms of economy?
Well, I mean, first of all, when it comes to those waivers of some countries, half a dozen of countries who are importing Iranian oil, those waivers were put in place. Some of them are going to expire soon. Probably we're going to see the renewal of waivers for a smaller amount of states in the next.
Do you expect Turkey will be among them?
This I don't know. This I don't know.
It depends on the discussions between Turkey and US. Do you think?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So the thing is that those sanctions have halved Iranian oil exports. So they're
till now.
Yes.
Oh,
so
okay.
They're being quite strong in curbing, Iran's capacity to export its oil. And although the Trump administration's objective was to reduce Iranian exports to zero, but since this is not really, a realistic thing to do, and they didn't want to also to antagonize many of the countries in the world, those waivers were granted. So we're not going to see Iranian oil exports dropping to zero, as the Trump administration has, put it as an objective. But what we have been seeing, and what we are going to continue to see, is a considerable reduction of Iranian oil exports.
So, with the time passing, you expect that these sanctions will be effective. But how about the result? What's going on in Iran? I mean, because some of the people who are arguing against these sanctions were saying that if these sanctions makes it worse for the people, then the hardliners will, have the better say about things going on, and things will get complicated. What do you think?
So you mean, let me say something first of all about the, efficiency of sanctions on the international level before, saying something about the domestic situation and the ramifications there. I think what has been, many observers before the U.S., announced that it's going to reimpose U.S. sanctions on Iran, expected those U.S. sanctions not to be super effective. Because they were arguing that in contrast to almost 10 years ago when we had EU and UN support for those sanctions on Iran, this time around there is a lack of political support. So this will make the sanctions, almost not very much effective. But the truth of the matter is that those sanctions have been effective because there is one continuity between then and now, which is the dominance of the United States in the international financial and banking systems that no country can really escape from, given that the US dollar is still the world currency. Right. So all of that has pushed companies and states as well to retreat from the Iranian market. So, major European companies, as you might know, have retreated from the Iranian market in the summer of last year. So those sanctions, in contrast to many observers, assessments, have been effective actually, and have exacerbated the economic situation in Iran that is quite dire. So there are high unemployment rates, the currency that is really falling, and high inflation. All those problems are homemade, but they were exacerbated by US sanctions. So what sanctions basically do in a nutshell is that they illegalize legal trade. Mm-hmm. And when doing so, it opens the door for actors in Iran, for example, to engage in black markets and so forth. So basically what has happened during the crippling sanctions regime, during the Bush administration, Obama years, we've seen that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has been able to monopolize a lot of imports. Right. So the black markets are actually flourishing as a consequence of sanctions. There are a lot of actors on the domestic scene that are benefiting from those sanctions because they can, they're benefiting in relative terms, of course. And there are also, also it paves the way for more corruption because there are other economic actors that, for example, choose not to sell their products because they're expecting their products to be much more, expensive in the future. So there's a lot of, games and corrupt games around sanctions that are being played out on the domestic level. On the international level, there are also a lot of, benefactors of those sanctions because they understand that because of the pressure that is put on Iran, politically and economically, Iran is finding itself in a position of weakness. So there are a lot of international actors that are trying to, use that situation or abuse that situation. For example, understanding that Iran is in a position of weakness, and then the Iranians would, sell them, for example, oil at a cheaper level, and basically because of the sanctions and the exclusion of Iran from the financial system, they set up some barter mechanisms. So
exactly, and Turkey had a trial regarding that kind of mechanisms and the Halkbank case, as we know it, right?
Yes.
We know it well.
Exactly. Yeah. So basically, in short, those barter mechanisms are designed as follows. So the Iranians will be able to export their oil, but instead of having their money repatriated, they import or they get the goods that they might not otherwise actually buy.
Right.
So yeah, there have been a lot of Chinese products, for example, flooding the Iranian market. The Indians are doing the same thing. The Russians have thought about the same thing. Turkey as well. So there are a lot of actors who are doing the same thing. And also Instex, the special purpose vehicle set up by the European Union, is also designed as a barter mechanism.
Right. So if we go back to the Iranian politics, because the recent, the surprise resignation of the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, today we learned that, and we were expecting also that Mr. President Rouhani didn't accept the resignation, but some people thought that it is related to also this new American policy against Iran somehow. Do you think so? Do you agree so? Can we say that it was the pressure against him inside the regime was related to the new U.S. policy or his stance regarding the U.S. policies?
What is true is that the new U.S. policy on Iran after Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA is the context against which all of this has been happening, because this particular move by Washington has put Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, and also the administration of Rouhani in a very difficult position. After all, their main achievement during all those years was the conclusion of the Iran nuclear deal. And now, with the U.S. withdrawal, the Iran nuclear deal is on the verge of collapse. And because of the reimposition of sanctions, Iran is not getting the economic dividends that it hoped for, and also that those, the foreign minister and the president of Iran have promised more or less to the Iranian people. So the economic dividends are not really on the horizon. Instex is probably not going to do the job either. And after the U.S. withdrawal, and because of the lack of those economic dividends, the hardline, the opponents inside of Iran against the JCPOA have been strengthened. Right. And all of that has put Zarif and Rouhani in a very difficult situation when they would still argue that it would be good to remain in the JCPOA and and wait and see and try to salvage the nuclear deal together with the Europeans. So Zarif has been on that regard under a lot of pressure inside. And also, there's been also this episode or ongoing episode of the of a bill in the Iranian parliament being passed against money laundering and terrorism financing, which is important for the Europeans so that they feel more at ease in engaging with business in Iran. But there are hardline opponents of the administration who have a political and economic stakes when this bill is passed. And Zarif and Rouhani were really, encouraging this bill to be passed, but there's been this point of friction. Right. So there's been, some pressure, increased pressure on Zarif.
Okay, especially at this part of the world, sanctions, because of the history of the Iraqi sanctions, maybe, are seen as a prelude to some kind of a military action for regime change. And also, as we see from the, Israel, Saudi stance regarding Iran, that they are now friends against Iran, and also Americans are trying to unite other countries behind maybe Saudis and Israel. So there's some people are thinking that these are going to turn out to be some kind of a military action against Iran. Do you think so? Do you expect so?
Well, yes, in the history we've had cases that war and military action were succeeding the imposition of economic sanctions, like in the case of Iraq. And the Iraqi case is also quite important to bear in mind because sanctions cost a lot of human lives there. During the decade-old UN-mandated sanctions regime on Iraq, according to UN figures, we've around 500,000 of young kids were killed basically as a consequence of sanctions. This goes along not because only sanctions do not allow for even humanitarian trade, because although they're in most cases exempted, for example in the Iranian case, it's still, companies are still reluctant to engage in purely even humanitarian transactions because they still face, or they still fear the sword of Damocles of U.S. sanctions. Right. So this is why, even on the humanitarian front, it's difficult to engage in business. On the other hand, what authoritarian regimes also do, they externalize the cost of sanctions onto the general population. So the combination of both of those factors, makes the heart of average citizens, the life of average citizens, very, very hard. So in the Iranian case, we have also authoritarian elements who are strengthened by the sanctions. And also the economic, the political situation is also exacerbated, the political climate is exacerbated by the imposition of sanctions. And this could pave the way into a more confrontational interaction between Iran and the United States and perhaps other actors that you mentioned in the region further down the road. But if war going to be a consequence of the current sanctions regime in Iran, I doubt it, because war, as on the scale that we've seen in the case of Iraq, is probably not going to happen in the case of Iran, because Iran is a much larger country, so it's much more difficult to go for a military solution to whatever problem. This would require U.S. boots on the ground, at least. And all of that is probably not going to happen given the domestic situation in the United States, and also the reluctance of the military to engage in such a large-scale war effort against Iran, a country that in comparison to a decade ago is much more powerful and influential in this region. So the costs of such a military adventure would be much, much higher than in the past. So I don't think that we're going to see a large conflagration, but we might see a low-level military conflict here and there.
You expect. How about the people in Iran? I mean, when we are talking about sanctions, as you mentioned, they pay the price mostly, but nobody takes their views about these issues. Not all the time, at least. Do they really agree with what, for example, the U.S. asks from Iran? That is, giving up the nuclear work, also getting their troops from Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere, Yemen. What do they think about it, or do they care about it? How do they feel?
I think in Iran, as in many other countries, we have a very diverse, spectrum of opinions on those questions. It is true that some sections of the population would agree that Iran should devote its energy and resources not on regional theaters of conflict, but to the problems that Iran faces domestically. So there is this kind of desire, but if they accept the Trump administration to be really the advocate of those Iranian wishes, it's another issue. I think there is no illusion whatsoever about about the Trump administration, as I think there is no illusion about the Trump administration in a lot of parts of this world, right, when it comes to promoting positive and benign values. So this is one side. On the other side, what we see, what you can see in contrast to a decade ago, for example, when we, preceding the JCPOA, when we had quite a crippling economic sanctions regime on Iran. Back then, also, in the wake of the neocons in the United States being at the helm of power, you've seen or you saw a rallying around the flag effect in Iran because of the imposition of sanctions, coupled then with the permanent threat of military strike. But now you see a different tendency, that people primarily blame their own government for the economic situation, and partly also for for facilitating, pressure from the outside. Not, the administration, but probably more hardline elements who, with their rhetoric, might have paved the way for such actions from the outside as well. So you have this tendency actually that their own government, Iranians' own government, is blamed for their economic challenges, and so this is quite a new development in Iran.
So the society is also changing, but do you think this will make up to a change in some of the policies domestically and also internationally in Iran? I mean, how can the system change there? Do you think people will do that?
Because
there were, all those protest movements, and they're harshly, stopped by the government militarily.
Yes, that's true. Protests have continued despite the reimposition of U.S. sanctions. So there's been no rallying around the flag effect. There's not being, this realization we should not protest against our government because this can be abused by foreign powers. So, this is not part of the calculations that are really, among those who take to the streets. And whether sanctions will exacerbate the situation to a level that we're going to see a collapse of the regime? I don't think so, because there is still the monopoly of violence on one side of the equation, and there is a huge power asymmetry between those who take to the streets, who protest, and those who are at the power. So we're not probably going to see that. What we might be seeing further down is that because of the state's problems in terms of resources and shrinking resources as a consequence of sanctions, and the economic situation that is really, really bad, that actually the Islamic Republic will have to somehow negotiate with the United States, publicly or non-publicly, but they are forced to come to the table, because this economic situation is homemade. So this is one side. On the other side, it's also exacerbated by sanctions, and the one international actor that can do something about that is the United States. It's not Europe. So we might see some kind of an Iranian-American kind of negotiation further down the road, if those sanctions, if the pressure becomes just unbearable. So if the pressure is too much, we might see such a scenario. But until then, we might see, things continue as they are.
Yeah, I think maybe not with Trump's administration, maybe also there should be a change in the U.S. policy, because, for example, in his recent State of the Union address, for example, he says, the world's leading state sponsor of terror, but also they're very good friends with the Saudi Arabia, which is in so many cases the sponsor that we know that they are sponsoring terrorism. So, I mean, how would this work? Do you think the Trump administration is willing or capable of coming, on the negotiation table with Iran?
That's true. I mean, first of all, it's an utterly, contradictory stance to just target Iran and forget about other actors in this region. So this is true. But on the other hand, what Trump has said in the past, although it was on Twitter basically, he opened the possibility for talks with the Iranian president. So this is also what he mentioned, at least in his tweets. And Trump is usually considered to be a transactional president. So you can engage in deals with him much better than probably with with another American president. So there is an advantage to Trump, who might be more eager to engage in any kind of transaction that might actually be more favorable to the Islamic Republic than the Islamic Republic talking with a Trump successor. Okay. As we've seen, also the North Korean case is also an example here, where Trump has been willing to engage in some kind of, negotiation. Although, the North Korean case, it has not been really robust.
Right. Can I ask also, the situation in Syria is, I think, very important in all what we talked about. I mean, do you agree so? And do you expect it to be resolved in a way that will help this problem we specifically mentioned, that the U.S. Pressuring Iran to take, their soldiers out of the region? Do you expect such a thing?
Yes, this is the situation that we have actually after the territorial defeat of Daesh over a year ago. That there have been multiple actors who were critical towards the Iranian presence in Syria. So that starts with the Russians, who are considered to be, a strong ally of the Iranians, but the Russians also don't want the Iranians to have too much influence in Syria. Secondly, Israel has been unhappy with Iranian presence not far from its borders, which then led to Israeli strikes on Iranian installations in those areas in Syria, accompanied by Russian indifference, or Russian silence on those strikes. And the Iranians so far have not been really, reacting to those Israeli strikes.
Right.
However, in the future, the calculation in Tehran might change. That they would, see the necessity of reacting to those Israeli strikes and not to just, sit and wait. Also the United States, of course, is against any kind of, Iranian presence there. So Iran is facing a lot of actors from different sides who are not really favoring its presence there. But having said that, Iran is going to be in Syria, so there will be an Iranian presence. But the question will be how strong it will be, especially militarily speaking.
Right. Okay. Maybe as a last question, because you also know the European way of seeing things, and how could Europe help this, the resolution of this specific problem? Do you think they have a chance to do so, because they are insisting that the nuclear deal, 2015 nuclear deal, is working, has been working? So this new action Trump taking is wrong. Do you think they will come to the point that Trump is right? What do you think? What can we expect?
The Europeans are obviously in a very difficult, position since Trump withdrew from the nuclear deal, and what they have been trying to do is to salvage the nuclear deal with Iran by, implementing or by creating this special purpose vehicle called
Right.
INSTEX, that for now is only limited to humanitarian goods. And if they will not be able to extend it onto other more economically strategic sectors, those economic dividends that Tehran expects are not going to, to materialize. So this is one side of the story. The other side of the story is that when it comes to non-nuclear issues, there is more convergence than differences of opinion probably between Europe and the United States when it comes to Iran's regional role or Iran's ballistic missile program. So both sides, although to a different degree, see all of that as quite critical. So, the Europeans also, given the, the impending sunset clauses of the JCPOA, that is that, all those limitations put on Iran will disappear in a few years. So they have to start thinking about the post-JCPOA era in any case. And for that, they have to extend the portfolio of topics onto other areas, including Iran's regional policies. So I think this is, and this is going to be very, very difficult because from the Iranian side, the appetite is not so large to engage, in negotiations that might limit their ballistic missile program that the Iranians view as their most effective deterrent capability against the potential aggressor from the outside. But I'm not saying that this is, out of question that such negotiations can lead to success. But what Europe needs to do is to use its influence that it has in Tehran to force the Iranians to grant some course corrections. And in exchange to that, if it's not able to give the economic benefits to Iran, to have to show Iran that Iran can still be a respected guest, for example, in international fora. So some kind of political or diplomatic kind of support that can be granted in exchange. So I think there are possibilities because on the Iranian side there is also, a motivation to do something about that situation. If sanctions, for example, can be reduced. And then, of course, the United States comes into play. So whatever Europe does, so it's going to be in coordination with the United States, or it should be in coordination with the United States. But Europe plays an important role because it has much better relations, of course, with Iran.
I said last, but maybe Leslie, you can say a few things about the Iranian-Turkish relations in regards to the, Syria, Iraq, the regional issues, but also about this sanctions regime. Turkey is now exempt from the sanctions for a while, but you said you don't know that what will happen next. But do you think Turkey and Iran now they are working, for example, together for Syria dossier? But are they really in good terms regarding these issues?
I think more or less, yes. Turkish-Iranian relations are quite solid, because they have a material base, which is energy. So this is not going to disappear in the near future. Both are obviously neighbors. There is bilateral trade that is not, that's quite important as well. And they have a similar view on some of the most strategic issues in the region. For example, when it comes to the Kurdish question. So they have very, a convergence of interests. Obviously Turkey is also having good relations with Saudi Arabia, but it is also trying to have good relations with Iran. So it's not an actor that is going into the Saudi camp. And Turkey as well has good relations with Israel as well. So this is a constellation that is quite, I think, stable and is not going to change in its major constellation in the foreseeable future.
Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad, thank you very much for being with us. It was an insightful talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.